pretty much breaks down even more than it already has. And so you have to think about a structural shift of people from cars to transit. And in fact, our historical approach to dealing with increasing energy demands was simply to find an unattractive, unsafe waterfront lot in an outer borough, mainly in a minority or impoverished neighborhood, and put a new power plant in that place. And since 2002, when the mayor embraced environmental justice as a basis for policy, and as the city got safer, and as we decided to really revitalize our waterfront, and as we realized that there were no such thing as an unattractive neighborhood in New York City, we don't actually have places for new power plants in the future. And so efficiency itself became a strategy for coping with growth. And then all of that got wrapped up in the overarching discussion of climate change, and it turned out that carbon emissions are a great indicator for all of the things that make a city like New York function and make it what we want to be. And therefore, if you reduce your carbon emissions, and you do so in a thoughtful way, you are in fact incrementally getting towards a city with a greater orientation towards transit, a city with more greenery in its outdoor spaces, a city where people walk and bike rather than drive, a city where we are using less electricity per capita and we are getting our electricity from other sources. And so at the end of the day, what turned out to be the great insight of PlaNYC was that here in New York, at least, we can have our cake and eat it too. Because being more efficient is actually working with the grain of New York City and not working against it. And I sometimes feel sorry for my colleagues who have to do sustainability planning in places like Los Angeles and Nassau County, because I don't actually know what to tell them. But here in New York, it turned out that we could, in fact, be ourselves and be efficient. And we came out with PlaNYC in April 2007, and it has 127 initiatives that ran the gamut from congestion pricing, which I won't go into because we still have teams to have that all played out. But the good news is, of course, nearly a quarter of the taxi fleet has already converted to hybrids, even though we got our taxi regulation overturned by a federal judge. But once again, the economics are so compelling that the owner-operators chose to do it as soon as the mayor started talking about it. And we have gotten 278,000 trees planted in the city in the last 2.5 years. 278,000 trees. So we are, in fact, almost 30,000 ahead of schedule. And we are making progress on our green buildings legislation, which I believe will be passed by the City Council by the end of this year, where we'll tackle the real heart of the problem with energy efficiency in our cities, which is not how to make new buildings green, but how to make existing buildings greener, because the vast majority of the buildings we're going to have in our future we already have today, so we can't just rely on new buildings. And we've worked in a counterintuitive way to actually build a power plant, and that last permitted and sited location, where we think it may well be the last new power plant ever built in New York City using fossil fuels. But it turns out that a brand new natural gas turbine is so much more efficient than the 40-year-old natural gas turbines that it will push out of our supply stack, that this one new fossil fuel powered plant that will produce 500 megawatts of electricity in Astoria will actually reduce our carbon footprint citywide by 3 to 3.5%. So we're making a great deal of progress. Where we're not making progress, of course, is in some of the areas that Rob alluded to, where jurisdictions clash, where the metrics by which agencies and politicians and leaders and different levels of government actually are not measured by the extent to which they work together towards these common problems, and whether it is in transit financing, or in national energy efficiency and carbon legislation, or in a myriad of other things I don't have to go into. Is here in the audience, J.P. Rosenzweig, leading an effort, working with the city to develop long-term climate change projections. With that information, we're working with the companies and agencies and institutions that own and operate the critical infrastructure in the 5 boroughs, so that they understand the risks that their specific infrastructure is facing. And with that information and knowing whether it's sea level rise or heat waves or droughts or violent storms or flooding, any of the impacts that we will see, we will learn from that risk assessment At what point do individual adaptation measures get overwhelmed? And at what point do we really need to begin thinking about a citywide strategy for adaptation, or even, I think, more precisely, for resilience? Because climate change adaptation, I think, has in some circles gotten a lot of attention, and unfortunately I think it often gets discussed in a sky is falling kind of way. Now, there's no question it is of critical importance that we begin thinking about it and that we are doing. But what we can't afford to do is rush to make decisions based, number one, on projections that are highly uncertain, and number two, to fool ourselves into thinking that we can prevent all change. And so I'd like to suggest that when we think about climate change adaptation, we really do need to start thinking instead of the term resilience, because some of the events that we will experience are ones that we're never going to be able fully to prevent. The analogy I use for that is we don't try to stop a snowstorm. We simply try to make sure that we can clean up the city as quickly as possible and we don't have any long-term damage from it. And I think we may have to start thinking about the impacts of climate change in a very similar way, because I'm not convinced that there is a way to prevent every type of flooding, every type of heat impact, every type of drought from affecting our infrastructure. It's simply too big a change to make, and the forces of nature that we're facing are simply too great. But even if we knew exactly what the right strategy for resilience against climate change was, I think we then actually face the challenge of dealing with how we encourage and in fact convince the public to change their attitude towards that risk. And here's where I think some of the unfortunate lessons from history have to inform the way we think about policy in the future. Fundamentally, any kind of investment we make in our long-term future is essentially in the nature of a collective insurance policy. And the level of investment that we are willing to make will depend precisely on the awareness and the appetite for risk on behalf of the general public. And so if, yes, it's true, as it was true in 1970 when we started working on the third water tunnel, there is a general notion that at some point one of our two water tunnels either will fail or will need to be taken out of service and half the city will be without running water. Yes, that's a risk, but clearly in 1970 and again in 1975 and 76 and 77 when the city went bankrupt and into the 1980s when we dealt with fluctuations in the economy, the appetite for investment and the willingness to protect ourselves against that long-term risk was simply insufficient to keep those projects going. Mayor Bloomberg is very proud of the fact that when he came into office, he determined that by the time his last budget, which of course at the time of his office was the one currently in effect, but nonetheless, his last budget would see through the completion of the third water tunnel, and I think it will. But that was a major statement of policy and priorities that frankly wasn't fully shared